Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the era when people still squinted at lamplight and swore that a shiny brass tube could solve their every problem. You're standing in a foggy alleyway, lantern smoke curling like dragon's breath in the night air. In the window of a little workshop sits something strange. A polished box, gleaming lenses, gears that catch the glow. It doesn't look like much, half furniture, half invention. But back then, this was the machine everyone whispered about. Not just a device for catching light. Oh no. To your neighbors, this curious contraption promised something far more soothing. It was a supposed miracle for restless nights. You hear someone mutter, "Sleep in seconds, no potions needed." Tempting, right? Except you probably wouldn't survive one of those chemical whiffs without a long coughing fit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love it if you posted your location and your local time down in the comments. It's always fun to see who's drifting off with us around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past crooked cobblestones, following the scent of oil lamps and ink, until you reach the first makeshift studios, where cameras were barely more than experimental toys. The year is somewhere in the early 19th century, though no one around you bothers with exact dates. They're too busy gossiping about whether these lantern boxes are genuine marvels or merely parlor tricks. When inventors like Joseph Nicephore Niepce started tinkering with light-sensitive surfaces, most folks couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of preserving an image. Instead, some believed these glowing contraptions had been built to coax the human body into slumber, mechanical lanterns of dream. Imagine a tired Victorian clerk, eyes red from candlelight account books, staring at a brass lens as if it were a hypnotist's watch. He's convinced that the faint halo of light shimmering off the polished surface might send him sliding into a nap. Historians still argue whether Niepce himself encouraged such mystical associations or whether the public invented them out of pure wishful thinking. Either way, the confusion took hold. The strange thing is, the atmosphere around those early experiments really did feel sleepy. You'd sit in a dim room, curtains drawn tight, the only glow coming from filtered sunlight sneaking through a lens. The silence stretched so long that your heartbeat became the loudest sound. If you were stuck there, waiting while some fragile coating tried to capture light, drowsiness practically ambushed you. Some observers mistook that drowsiness for proof that the camera was designed to cure insomnia. And of course, every invention needs a good story. Word spread like jam on warm bread. These boxes weren't just scientific novelties, but lanterns for the weary. "Why drink bitter tonics?" whispered the advertisements that never officially existed, "when you can rest before the sleep lantern?" Quirky rumors swirled around, too. One pamphlet claimed that if you pointed the device toward your pillow at dusk, the soft halo it reflected would scare away night demons. Another insisted the first lenses had been polished with moonstone, which supposedly radiated calming energy. Spoiler, they were just bits of ground glass, and calming wasn't really in their vocabulary. Still, the idea stuck. Foggy lanterns that doubled as sleep engines. People wanted to believe it. Remember, this was the same age when folks dabbed crocodile dung concoctions as sunscreen or swallowed mercury pills for vitality. A brass box promising nap time. Honestly, it seemed less absurd than most of what was already being sold. The little workshops glowed late into the night, curious onlookers pressing against dusty windows. Inside, inventors fiddled with glass plates, dark curtains, and awkward tripods while onlookers murmured, "See? The lantern hums you into dreams." The reality was that the only hum came from your own ears straining against silence. But the placebo was strong. People walked away swearing they had felt drowsy, like the glow itself was rocking them to sleep. And here's the kicker. Many of those early photographers didn't bother correcting the rumor. Why would they? Let the public believe the box could both preserve faces and banish insomnia. Two miracles for the price of one. After all, who doesn't want an excuse to buy something that looks half like a cabinet and half like a magician's trunk? Of course, you now know cameras wouldn't keep anyone asleep unless the smell of chemicals happened to knock them out. But in those early, foggy lantern days, the story was enough. You step away from that alley workshop, lantern smoke still in your hair, ears buzzing faintly from the hush, and wonder how many weary Victorians stumbled home certain they had glimpsed the birth of a dream machine, when really they had only seen light being trapped on a plate. You shuffle further along the gaslit street, and before long, you notice how every curious household that's acquired one of these strange contraptions insists on demonstrating it with the same little ritual. Someone draws the curtains, another fiddles nervously with brass fittings, and then comes that delicate moment, a finger resting on the shutter. When it finally clicks, sharp, precise, almost like the sound of a fingernail tapping porcelain, everyone hushes. And in that hush, people begin to whisper that the click itself carries magic. It's faint, barely louder than the pop of a distant lamp. But Victorians start convincing themselves that this noise, repeated often enough, could lull anyone to sleep. You can picture it. Children in stiff nightshirts begging, "Do the click again, Papa," as if the shutter were a lullaby. Neighbors claim it works better than warm milk. By morning, you can already hear the rumor in the market stalls. Just one click, and my little one was out before her head touched the pillow. The reality is far less glamorous, of course. Most exposures in those early years lasted several minutes, even hours. A single snap didn't send you drifting. It was the long, mind-numbing stillness afterward that made eyelids heavy. Historians still argue whether ordinary people misunderstood the camera's stillness or if early entrepreneurs deliberately spun the noise into a selling point. Either way, the myth of the clicking lullaby caught on like wildfire. A quirky detail slips through here. In some towns, superstitious folk swore that if you placed your ear right next to the wooden box, you could hear not just the snap, but a faint hum continuing afterward, like a bee buzzing in a bottle. Supposedly, that hidden hum was the true sleep spell. More likely, it was wood creaking or your own imagination filling the silence. But imagination counts for a lot when you're desperate for a cure to sleepless nights. You stand in one drawing room while the local vicar demonstrates his newly purchased device. He insists the shutter's click mimics the rhythm of a human heartbeat, and therefore reassures the restless mind. He holds the box close to your face, as if you're supposed to nod off on command. Instead, you mostly notice how heavy and clunky the thing feels, like falling asleep under a church pew. Still, the idea charms the neighbors. There's a sly humor in how earnestly people cling to it. Imagine grown men arguing over the correct tempo of the click, some insisting you need a slow, solemn press for maximum drowsiness, while others swear that 2 quick taps are better, like a double pat on the head. It almost turns into a parlor game. Families gather after dinner, pass the box around, and each person tries their version of the lullaby click. Someone inevitably yawns, And of course, everyone points triumphantly. See? It works. A mainstream fact sneaks into the chatter. Louis Daguerre's improvements in the 1830s made cameras much more efficient, but the exposures were still demanding. The myth about the shutter soothing people only grew stronger because now you could actually hear a sharper, crisper snap. The better the mechanism, the more magical the click seemed. Never mind that the sleepiness came from holding your neck stiff while staring into darkness. You wander into another parlor where a mother sits beside her infant's crib, gently pressing the shutter again and again. The child blinks, then drifts off. Not because of the camera, of course, but because babies are world champions at falling asleep in spite of anything. Yet the mother beams. She's certain the little brass noise is a lullaby from the future. Historians still puzzle over whether some early photographers encouraged this belief to make cameras seem less threatening. After all, a box that steals your image sounds frightening. But a box that helps you sleep? That's comfort. It reframed the machine from ominous to cozy, like turning a goblin into a teddy bear. And you, sitting there, notice how the room's air grows heavier after hours of such click lullaby experiments. The curtains shut out the street lamps. The air smells faintly of dust and oil, and the hush thickens. Your shoulders sag. The trick isn't in the shutter. It's in the silence that follows. One guest leans close and murmurs, "You know, if you place the camera at your bedside, it clicks for you in dreams." That's the sort of claim that keeps spreading, embroidered, until the click of a shutter is spoken of like a magic incantation. Of course, you and I know the truth. The only real lullaby here is boredom and dim lighting. But try telling that to a Victorian who insists the future of sleep has arrived in the form of a wooden box with a brass eye. So you let them have their little illusion. After all, who doesn't enjoy a bedtime story, whether it comes from a voice or from the crisp, delicate sound of a shutter snapping closed in the dark? You step back out into the cool night, but the air quickly turns heavy with another peculiarity of this age, the unmistakable scent of chemicals. Every early camera session reeks of it, a mixture of iodine fumes, mercury vapors, and later, collodion's sharp sting, so pungent that your nostrils twitch before you even see the box itself. And here's where the sleepy confusion deepens. People start insisting those strange vapors aren't just part of the process. They're the real miracle. They say the smells themselves are soporific, the modern-day lavender of a restless world. You wander into a cramped studio where a photographer swirls silver nitrate across a plate. The acrid mist clings to your throat. Someone sighs dreamily beside you and whispers, "Do you smell that?" It's like a lullaby for the lungs. You resist the urge to cough. If that's a lullaby, it's the kind that leaves you with watery eyes and a headache the size of Westminster Abbey. But hey, sometimes discomfort masquerades as relaxation. People back then were ready to believe anything that might tame their sleepless nights. One mainstream historical fact: early daguerreotype processes really did require sitting in darkened rooms filled with iodine and mercury vapors. Photographers frequently suffered tremors, memory loss, and other symptoms of mercury poisoning. But your average visitor, unaware of the danger, interpreted the sudden wave of dizziness as proof the machine was lulling them toward sleep. Historians still argue whether photographers deliberately played along with this perception to reassure clients. After all, if your knees buckled mid-session, it was easier to believe you were relaxed than poisoned. Of course, the quirky rumors multiplied. A traveling pamphlet claimed that the iodine fog created an invisible blanket that tucked you in. Another insisted that the sharp tang of collodion aligned your inner humors with moonlight, producing the deepest slumber known to man. You can almost hear a smooth-voiced salesman crooning, "Why brew herbal tea when your very breath can be steeped in camera air?" In one parlor, you see a gentleman setting up his device not to photograph, but to perfume the room. He places small trays of chemicals under the lens, fans the air with a handkerchief, and instructs guests to inhale. One woman promptly swoons. He beams and declares, "See?" She's resting peacefully, while two maids scramble to catch her before she cracks her head on the floor. You can't help but chuckle. It's less restful nap and more emergency smelling salts in reverse. Yet the idea spreads. People begin bottling little vials of leftover collodion solution, keeping them on nightstands like scented oils. A whiff before bed, they say, keeps dreams soft and nightmares away. Never mind that the only thing it truly keeps away is the lining of your lungs. You picture families in narrow row houses, leaning over their new miracle boxes, inhaling as if the brass lens were an incense burner. They tell themselves they're embracing progress, that their grandchildren will laugh at anyone still clinging to chamomile tea. Meanwhile, their grandchildren will actually laugh at the thought of anyone inhaling mercury fumes for a good night's sleep. The hush of the studio, the dim curtains, the faint, almost sacred light. It all combines with those heady scents. You can almost convince yourself standing there that drowsiness is creeping up your spine. But it's not comfort, it's chemical fog. And once again, the Victorians mistake poison for peace. Historians still puzzle over how far this misconception really went. Did entire households truly believe they were being soothed into slumber? Or was it more of a parlor gag, something you claimed at parties while secretly fighting the urge to gag? The records are hazy, much like the air in those studios. But in the moment, you see it clearly. Brass boxes gleaming, glass plates waiting, and people inhaling as though the future of sleep has arrived in pungent form. You step out again, grateful for fresh air, while a neighbor sighs happily behind you, insisting the studio haze was just as gentle as roses. Sure, if roses burned your lungs and made your teeth feel loose. You walk further down the narrow Victorian lane and hear muffled laughter coming from an upstairs window. Curious, you climb the creaky stairs and find yourself in a parlor transformed into a sleep chamber. The heavy curtains are drawn. A brass camera stands on its spindly tripod, and in front of it sits a row of stiff-backed chairs. A family perches there like statues, eyes half closed, while a man in a waistcoat whispers instructions. Hold still, stay calm, let the machine cradle you. This is portrait photography, or at least it's meant to be. But to the people in the room, it doubles as nap therapy. The ritual of posing for a daguerreotype requires sitting utterly motionless for minutes on end, sometimes longer, with a brace clamped behind your neck to keep you steady. The silence stretches, the air grows thick, and inevitably, someone's head begins to nod. Instead of embarrassment, the group interprets it as evidence of the camera's mystical sleep powers. A mainstream fact here: exposure times in the early 1840s could range from several minutes to over half an hour, depending on lighting conditions. That meant sitters endured a stillness bordering on absurd. Historians still argue whether families actually fell asleep mid-session, or whether the rumor was exaggerated by clever photographers looking to hype their services. Either way, the myth of the nap-inducing portrait became part of the camera's mystique. You notice a boy in a sailor suit slumping sideways while his parents hiss, "Don't wake him," the camera soothes. In reality, he's just bored stiff from being told not to blink for 12 straight minutes. Another sitter yawns so wide that the resulting plate shows his face frozen mid-contortion. The photographer sells it as proof. See how the sleep lantern captures the soul's descent into dreams. You smother a laugh. It looks less like dreamland and more like a man about to swallow a doorknob. Quirky tidbit. Some studios actually marketed nap portraits, encouraging clients to pretend to sleep during their session. Customers believed that posing as a sleeper, with eyes shut and hands folded, would both yield a serene likeness and transmit genuine rest to the body. Imagine a whole family sitting stiffly, pretending to snooze while sweating under the lamp's heat, convinced that the brass lens was massaging their nerves. The room's quiet rhythm almost convinces you, too. The tick of a mantel clock, the heavy drape muffling street sounds, the photographer murmuring, "Still, still, still." You could drift off just from the monotony, but then your nose catches that familiar tang of collodion again, and you snap back with a cough. Romantic nap machine, more like fume-filled endurance test. One scholar of the period once wrote that early portraits have a unique sleepiness to them, not because the sitters intended it, but because the atmosphere of stillness seeped into their expressions. Historians still debate whether that dreamy quality is simply an accident of the long exposure times, or if people truly leaned into the sleep machine myth. Either way, the photographs carry an odd hush, as though the past itself were dozing. You glance again at the boy in his sailor suit. His parents are thrilled. They'll show that image to guests and boast, "The machine soothes even the restless child." Guests will nod politely. Never mind that the poor lad was simply bored into submission. By the end of the evening, you find yourself lulled too, not by the brass contraption's supposed magic, but by the sheer monotony of watching strangers pose in suffocating silence. Your limbs ache from sitting. Your mind drifts, and you finally understand how easily someone could mistake this tedium for therapy. It's not sorcery. It's just the world's longest bedtime story acted out in chairs. So you leave the parlor with one last chuckle, remembering that these families truly believed their stiff photo sessions doubled as dream sessions. The shutter may have clicked, but it was the waiting, the stillness, the hush that did the real work, if you could call accidental boredom a cure for insomnia. You wander onward, deeper into the alleys of this sleepy century, and sooner or later, you encounter the glittering novelty of daguerreotypes, their polished silver plates glimmering like tiny mirrors. People cradle them in velvet cases, as though they hold some rare jewel. And soon, another rumor takes hold. These images don't just capture faces, they trap the very aura of drowsiness itself. A gentleman in a tall hat insists as you approach, "When I sit for a daguerreotype, I always sleep better that night. The plate holds the weariness, you see. It drains the restlessness right out of me." He flips open a case to reveal his solemn likeness, stiff collar and all. You glance at it. It's less dream aura and more constipated with dignity. But he beams proudly, certain it glows with sedative power. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The daguerreotype, perfected around 1839 by Louis Daguerre, was the first widely adopted photographic process, creating detailed images on silver-coated copper plates. They were so reflective that people often saw their own ghostly reflection hovering over the portrait. That eerie shimmer fueled the belief that the plates were alive somehow, pulsing with hidden energy. Historians still argue whether early owners genuinely thought their portraits emitted calming vibrations, or whether it was more of a poetic fancy, the way we call a song soothing today. A quirky tidbit flourishes in one cafe where locals pass their daguerreotypes around like sleep charms. Rub the plate before bed, someone advises you, and the silver will whisper you into dreams. You try to imagine a whole row of Victorians polishing their portraits each night, as though buffing them could coax out moonlight. In reality, the only thing you'd get is tarnish under your fingernails. You watch as a woman shows off an image of her late husband. She presses it to her cheek and sighs. He watches me as I rest, and I sleep so soundly. The comfort is real, though not because of any camera sorcery. It's grief softened by ritual. Yet the idea spreads that daguerreotypes themselves radiate slumber, like a polished lullaby on a copper plate. Some even set the portraits by children's beds, convinced the calm expressions frozen on those tiny mirrors would teach the little ones how to rest. You picture a row of solemn, silver-faced uncles glaring down at a crib. Comforting, debatable, nightmare fuel, very possible. Historians still puzzle over whether children found those ghostly reflections reassuring or just creepy. And yet, the shine of those plates in lamplight does carry a strange hush. When you tilt one toward the flame, the image seems to fade, replaced by your own reflection swimming across the surface. That double vision, past and present layered together, feels dreamy, like a hallucination at the edge of sleep. It's easy to see how the weary mind, desperate for relief, might believe the object itself carried drowsy magic. In another parlor, a physician demonstrates a collection of daguerreotypes, claiming they absorb nervous energy. He sets them around the room like little mirrors angled toward a patient's bed. The patient lies stiff under the gaze of 10 solemn portraits, each one reflecting a tiny glint of candlelight. The doctor whispers, "The aura flows into the plates, leaving the mind light and free." The poor patient looks more spooked than soothed, but the doctor nods knowingly. Science, in his book, has spoken. You take one last look at the rows of shiny plates and realize the myth has sunk its roots deep. These aren't just family keepsakes, they're talismans of supposed sleep. And while you and I know it's really the dim room, the heavy silence, and the ritual itself that coax people toward drowsiness, the Victorians will keep polishing their daguerreotype dreams, convinced that silver and shadows are enough to rock them gently into the night. You step away from the velvet-lined parlors and out into the muddy roads where traveling salesmen rattle by with wagons stacked high with curiosities. Among the pots, pans, and patent medicines, a new star has joined the circuit, the sleep camera. Its peddlers are flamboyant, wide-smiling, and loud enough to wake the very sleepers they claim to soothe. But that doesn't stop the crowds from gathering, coins ready, because who wouldn't pay for a miracle that promises to tuck you in? Picture it, a salesman in a bright red waistcoat, balancing atop his wagon, holding a brass camera above his head like a holy relic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellows, "behold the modern cure for your weary minds. No tinctures, no tonics, no midnight rattling in your chest. Simply gaze into this wondrous box, and your eyelids shall fall as gently as autumn leaves." The audience gasps, some out of awe, others out of suppressed laughter. You stand among them, half amused, half intrigued, because even though you know better, there's something mesmerizing about the show. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Traveling sales of cameras in the mid-19th century really did occur. though they were often bundled with photography demonstrations and instructions. Cameras were expensive, so few bought them casually, but the idea of showcasing them at fairs and markets was part of the technology's spread. Historians still argue whether these salesmen deliberately promoted sleep machine myths, or if it was local folklore attaching itself to the novelty of the contraptions. The quirky details are even more fun. Some salesmen dressed in flowing robes, presenting themselves as professors of nocturnal science. Others painted stars and moons on their wagons, promising that their machines were tuned to lunar vibrations. One particularly ambitious fellow in Lancashire called himself the Sandman's Apprentice and insisted his cameras contained hidden reservoirs of dream dust sprinkled invisibly through the lens. Children squealed with delight, and exhausted parents were only too happy to believe. You step closer as the salesman performs his ritual. He places the camera on a stool, drapes the black cloth dramatically, and invites a volunteer. A tired-looking farmer sits down, leans toward the lens, and the salesman intones, "Breathe deeply. Let the lantern drink your worries." A hush falls. The shutter clicks. The farmer, who has been up since 4 a.m. tending livestock, promptly nods off. The crowd erupts. Proof at last. The machine works. Never mind that exhaustion, not brass and glass, did the trick. These demonstrations travel from town to town, leaving behind both laughter and whispered hope. Housewives talk about saving up to buy one, husbands boast of scientific rest, and children ask if the machine might chase away monsters under the bed. Meanwhile, photographers quietly grit their teeth, wishing people would focus on the actual marvel, image-making, rather than fairy tales about sleep. But sometimes, the peddlers lean into the fantasy. One salesman sells tiny wooden toys shaped like miniature cameras, claiming they'll help children nap if placed by the pillow. Another offers pamphlets with instructions for proper drowsy exposure. Sit before the lens at dusk. Close your eyes. Breathe the chemical air. And wait for dreams to arrive. It's more bedtime theater than medical advice. But the audiences eat it up. Historians still debate whether these exaggerated claims harmed photography's early reputation or actually helped spread fascination with the technology. After all, even the skeptics who scoffed at the sleep machine myth still walked away remembering the name camera. Confusion, in its own odd way, was free advertising. You follow the wagon as it trundles out of town, bells jangling, the salesman's voice echoing behind. No bed too hard, no mind too restless. The lantern shall cradle you all. You can't help but smile. The myth lives on not because it's true, but because people crave stories that promise gentleness at the end of a long day. You trail the peddlers' wagons into the echoing halls of medicine, where men in stiff coats and wire spectacles declare they can prove, once and for all, that cameras cure sleeplessness. You enter a physician's consulting room, dark drapes drawn, the air heavy with tincture bottles, and there in the center sits a massive wooden camera like an altar. The doctor rubs his hands together, adjusts his waistcoat, and beckons you closer. "Behold," he says in a solemn tone, "the most modern tool of our century. No longer shall the restless toss. No longer shall the mind pace at midnight. The lantern box is both cure and comfort." He gestures toward a weary patient slumped in a chair. The man's head is clamped in place by iron braces, eyes wide as the black cloth drapes over him. The camera lens points directly at his face. The room is so dim that even your own heartbeat sounds indecently loud. The doctor raises his hand, snaps the shutter, and then folds his arms smugly as the patient's head droops forward. "You see?" he whispers triumphantly. "Already dreaming." You lean closer. The poor fellow has simply fainted from lack of air under the suffocating cloth. Hardly the peaceful nap advertised. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Doctors in the 19th century did experiment with photographic technologies in medical contexts, sometimes believing the scientific light could reveal or even influence the body's hidden states. Some even linked it to mesmerism, the popular belief that unseen forces could calm or heal patients. Historians still argue whether the sleep machine association was an honest medical hypothesis or more of a publicity stunt masquerading as therapy. Quirky anecdotes abound. One doctor in Paris claimed that long exposures recalibrated the nervous system, the way winding a clock resets its ticking. Another in Vienna had patients place their feet on trays beneath the camera tripod, insisting that vibrations from the mechanism traveled up their legs like gentle lullabies. More likely, it just gave them cramps. Yet these bizarre rituals were performed with absolute seriousness, as though brass and glass alone could cure the chaos of sleeplessness. You stand in the consulting room while the doctor paces with a notebook. He scribbles, "Patient exhibited yawning. Significant evidence of sedation." You cough politely, wanting to add, "He yawned because you made him sit in the dark for 20 minutes." But the physician beams, satisfied that the machine works. The atmosphere itself could fool anyone. These rooms are dim, curtains heavy, silence unbroken but for the doctor's whisper. The camera becomes part of a larger performance, a pseudo-scientific lullaby. And you realize that half of medicine in this century relies less on results than on ritual. Another patient arrives, a woman pale from weeks of insomnia. The doctor seats her, lowers the hood, and instructs her to gaze into the brass lens until her eyes grow heavy. Minutes crawl by. She finally sighs, slumps, and the doctor nods with delight. But you notice her hand clutching her side. She's simply exhausted from sitting upright in corsets for too long. Historians still puzzle over whether any patients genuinely slept better after such camera cures, or whether they simply played along to please the doctor. The records are vague, filled with words like restful, calm, and tranquilized, which could just as easily describe boredom as genuine therapy. One particularly eccentric physician even suggested attaching small cameras to bedposts so that couples could enjoy nightly exposure to soothing light. The idea never caught on, mostly because no one wanted to risk smashing their nose on a box of brass and wood while rolling over in the dark. Yet for all their oddity, these experiments reveal something touching. People longed desperately for rest. They were willing to try anything: potions, magnets, crocodile dung, and now cameras, if only it promised relief from endless nights. And though the results were dubious at best, the ritual gave them a story to cling to. So you step out of the consulting room, the doctor's voice fading behind you, promising breakthroughs that never came. You breathe fresh air, shake the chemical haze from your hair, and wonder how many patients went home that night clutching both a prescription and a whispered belief that their photograph had carried them closer to dreamland. You drift from the dim hush of consulting rooms to a much louder scene. The bustling fairgrounds. Canvas tents flap in the breeze. Fiddlers scrape out merry tunes, and vendors hawk sticky sweets. And right there between the fortune teller's booth and the man selling patent corset stretchers stands a stall draped in blue velvet, proudly advertising the Miracle Sleep Camera. Rest in seconds. Crowds gather, eager and skeptical, craning necks to glimpse the marvel. Inside the tent, lanterns swing, casting golden halos on the wooden box perched on its tripod. A demonstrator bows deeply, tips his tall hat, and in his most theatrical tone announces, "Ladies and gentlemen, behold the future of slumber." He flourishes a black cloth like a magician's cape and invites a volunteer from the crowd. A farmer, sunburnt and yawning already, stumbles forward. The demonstrator positions him before the brass lens, lowers the cloth, and hushes the crowd. After a long, silent moment, the shutter clicks. The farmer sways, head drooping. The crowd erupts, proof once again that the device works. Of course, you notice the farmer had been yawning even before he stepped under the cloth, but subtle truths rarely dampen a good spectacle. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Throughout the 19th century, fairs and exhibitions were a major way new technologies were introduced to the public, including photography. Audiences often didn't understand the mechanics, so they projected their own hopes and fears onto the inventions. Historians still argue whether the sleep camera myth truly surfaced in official demonstrations or was a side effect of fairground showmanship layered with audience imagination. Quirky tidbit. Some fairs went all in, staging competitions where multiple volunteers would sit before rival cameras, and the fastest sleeper won a prize, often a jar of dream salts or a velvet sachet embroidered with moons. One flyer even promised a grand prize nap on the softest mattress in the county. You picture these contests as both hilarious and vaguely dangerous. Rows of people feigning snoozes while children giggle and throw apple cores. You watch as the demonstrator hypes the crowd further. "This machine," he proclaims, "works by drawing wakefulness into its lens, sealing it away like smoke in a bottle. You will sleep because the lantern has stolen your unrest." The audience shivers with delight. You resist the urge to mutter, "It's really just swallowing your patience." The rituals themselves grow elaborate. Some demonstrators add incense, others spin colored lantern wheels behind the camera to produce hypnotic shadows. The crowd, already softened by cider and roasted chestnuts, swears they feel drowsy. And in fairness, the late hour, heavy food, and hours of fairground noise probably do make their eyes heavy. But they attribute it all to the miraculous machine. One salesman tries to upstage the rest with what he calls the midnight exposure. He dims every lantern, instructs the crowd to hold hands, and promises that when the shutter snaps, all will feel a wave of calm. He counts dramatically. 3, 2, 1, click. Everyone sits in darkness, listening to their own breathing. Inevitably, someone yawns, and the entire crowd gasps in reverence. Another myth cemented. Historians still debate how much these demonstrations damaged photography's credibility among serious scientists. Some journals of the time dismissed such displays as carnival nonsense, while others argued that they drew much-needed attention to the possibilities of light and lenses. Either way, the public memory fused photography with the promise of rest. You shuffle out of the tent as the crowd surges forward to buy pamphlets with moonlit illustrations. Behind you, the demonstrator's voice floats into the night. Sleep without effort, dream without fear, thanks to the miracle of modern light. The fiddlers strike up another tune. Children tug their parents' sleeves, and you can't help but laugh. The fairground has sold many absurdities: mechanical cradles, lightning-bottled tonics, hats that promise hair regrowth. And now cameras join the chorus, cloaked in velvet and dreams. As the lanterns dim and the fairground quiets, you realize how easily myth thrives in noise and spectacle. A box that captures light also captures imagination, and for a weary Victorian, imagination is as good as a lullaby. You leave behind the carnival clang and chatter, stepping instead into the hushed rumors that pass along alleyways, coffee houses, and smoky taverns. The talk now is not about public demonstrations, but about something more secretive, something whispered in a tone of awe. People speak of the midnight exposure, the notion that if a photographic plate is left open in the darkness, it does more than capture light. Supposedly, it siphons restlessness itself straight out of the room. Picture yourself in a narrow Victorian parlor, curtains drawn tight, only a faint glimmer from the street lamp seeping between them. On a little tripod stands the camera, its brass lens uncovered, its insides hungry. Families gather in their nightshirts, speaking in soft voices, as though the box might startle. They wait and wait. At some hour, the father of the household clears his throat and whispers, "Do you feel it?" Someone nods. A child yawns. Soon, they are convinced that the camera has been steadily swallowing their wakefulness and storing it inside its glass plate. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Long exposures were indeed a part of early photography. Some images required several minutes, even hours, of open exposure. During this time, people had to stay perfectly still, or else the image blurred. Historians still argue whether the leap from hours of stillness to the machine is drinking our energy was a genuine cultural belief or simply an exaggeration spread in newspapers hungry for a strange headline. Quirky tidbit. One pamphlet from the 1840s claimed that if you left a camera open all night, the plate would blacken with captured insomnia. The recommended treatment was to break the glass the next morning, releasing the restless energy into the fresh daylight like moths from a jar. Another version advised never to break the plate, since storing too much wakefulness residue could turn your attic into a cursed loft where nobody ever sleeps again. Neither instruction, of course, was especially practical. You imagine neighbors swapping ghost stories about cameras. "Don't point it at the bed," one insists, "or you'll wake with your dreams missing." Another warns that the box itself might grow restless if left too long, rattling in the night like a cat clawing at the door. You can almost hear the creak of wood and whisper of gears as anxious families peer through keyholes, wondering if their device is alive. The irony is that many people probably did sleep better during these rituals. Why? Because of the very act of preparation. Drawing the curtains, lighting a single candle, focusing attention on a nightly ritual. All these things slow breathing and soothe the nervous system. Whether you call it exposure, meditation, or placebo, it's not so different from modern sleep routines. You smile at the thought. Early photography wasn't curing insomnia, it was just inventing the bedtime ritual of sleep hygiene with a brass lens. And yet, belief takes on a life of its own. Rumors spread that professional midnight exposers would travel from town to town, offering to cleanse whole boarding houses of restlessness. They'd set up cameras in parlors and collect coins for the privilege of letting everyone sleep near the machine. The darker the night, the better. Some innkeepers even bragged about offering guests a photographic sleep guarantee. Historians still puzzle over a few journals that describe households keeping ward cameras in bedrooms, always aimed toward a restless sleeper's pillow. Were these devices actually used? Or were they just humorous exaggerations, scribbled down by skeptics poking fun at gullible relatives? The evidence is thin, but the myth has its charm. Of course, skeptics existed then too. A sharp-tongued wit in a London paper wrote that if cameras truly devoured wakefulness, then daguerreotype studios would be full of corpses napping on stools, never waking again. You chuckle at the mental picture. row upon row of snoring patrons while photographers tiptoe between them. The joke cuts, but the belief survives anyway, because hope is harder to stamp out than superstition. As you lean against the parlor wall, watching the family breathe slower and slower, you realize how powerful silence itself can be. The room is hushed, the only sound the faint tick of a clock, the candle guttering low, and then the soft sigh of the youngest child as sleep takes hold. In that moment, the camera doesn't need to do anything. It has already done enough, simply by convincing them to believe. You step quietly away, leaving the midnight exposure myth sealed in its brass chamber, another dream mistaken for science. You drift from those modest parlors into the echoing halls of wealth, where everything is amplified, lamps burn brighter, carpets sink deeper, and the oddities of fashion become full-blown spectacles. Here, in velvet-draped chambers and sprawling estates, the belief in cameras as sleep machines does not merely persist, it blossoms into theatrical obsession. Aristocrats, never content with a single brass contraption, begin installing entire galleries of them around their bedrooms, convinced that the more lenses pointed at their silken pillows, the more restful their dreams will be. Imagine a duke's chamber in the 1850s, vast windows blocked by thick curtains of crimson velvet, gilded mirrors angled just so, and in the center, a bed carved with swans and cherubs, wide enough for 6. All along the walls, like strange guardians, stand heavy cameras on polished tripods. The noble stretches out in embroidered nightclothes, while servants scurry about adjusting angles, as if directing a theater production. They whisper, "If the count snores, the machines will swallow the sound." It is a bedtime ritual bordering on the absurd, yet carried out with utmost solemnity. Mainstream historical fact: wealthy patrons of early photography did pour fortunes into private studios, believing cameras were scientific marvels worth flaunting. The line between science and superstition blurred, and the upper classes enjoyed turning their homes into laboratories of leisure. Historians still argue whether the sleep chamber tales are exaggerated gossip, mocking aristocrats for their frivolity, or genuine accounts of eccentric elites who wanted cameras not for portraits, but for imagined cures. Quirky tidbit: one duchess was said to have imported 12 daguerreotype machines from Paris, installing them in a circle around her canopied bed like watchful sentries. Her servants nicknamed the arrangement the Clock of Slumber, because every night she insisted on winding the tripods as though they were gears in a timepiece. Supposedly, she swore she awoke feeling lighter, as if her worries had been siphoned away by the silent lenses. You picture banquet conversations about the latest sleep parlor designs. Nobles would compare notes. Should the machines face the sleeper directly, or be turned sideways so the dreams didn't escape? One baron claimed that tilting the cameras upward made the stars filter into his sleep. Another insisted the machines must remain uncapped, otherwise the dream vapors couldn't escape. The debates were ridiculous, but the tone was grave. After all, when you've run out of wars and inheritances to fret about, why not worry about the alignment of imaginary sleep lenses? And still, there was pageantry. Invitations were sent out for slumber viewings, in which guests would gather to watch an aristocrat drift off beneath the gaze of multiple cameras. Musicians played harps in the corner, servants dimmed lanterns, and everyone tiptoed as though in a chapel. Some aristocrats even hired court poets to narrate their descent into dreamland, making the sleep chamber into a form of theater. Imagine sitting through that performance. Ah yes, the Duke is yawning, Observe how the brass guardians hum silently at his side. You stifle a laugh, even though the audience of the time took it very seriously. Historians still argue whether these spectacles were widely practiced, or if only a handful of eccentric families staged them, later exaggerated by satirists. Either way, the image lingers. Bedrooms turned into shrines, cameras worshipped as machines that inhaled sleeplessness and exhaled peace. But every spectacle has its cracks. A few visiting scholars, unimpressed, noted that nobles often fell asleep simply because their rooms were darker and quieter than most people's entire houses. Thick velvet drapes, soundproofed walls, feather mattresses. These luxuries alone could lull anyone into slumber. The cameras, heavy and solemn, were mere props. You smile at the thought. The aristocrats may have been paying for cameras, but what really bought their sleep was silence and a soft pillow. Of course, rumors traveled. Servants whispered that the nobles' dreams were being collected and stored in the machines, like tiny ghosts waiting inside the plates. Some even feared the devices might swap dreams if too many were left open at once. Imagine a butler worrying that his master's noble fantasies might trade places with his own dream about burnt toast and lost boots. The idea is comical, but the anxiety was real enough that some servants refused to sleep in the same room as a lens. And so, aristocratic bedrooms became places of awe, fear, and occasional farce. Guests marveled, poets scribbled, servants muttered, and the nobles themselves drifted into slumber, convinced that brass and glass were working in their favor. You leave them there, cushioned by wealth and delusion, cameras clicking softly in the dark like polite little guardians of the night. You step away from the velvet-swaddled chambers of nobles and into the cramped bustle of ordinary townhouses where the story of cameras as sleep machines takes on an even stranger twist. Here, in back alleys and dim kitchens, the devices are far fewer, the furniture rougher, and the superstition no less intense. The middle class, eager to imitate aristocratic fashions but unable to afford entire galleries of brass contraptions, begin experimenting with makeshift setups. You picture a modest parlor with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of last night's stew, where one lone camera sits on a wobbly chair facing a sagging bed. The owner, proud of his purchase, insists to his neighbors that it drains restlessness vapors as effectively as the 12-machine circle in the Duchess's mansion. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, cheaper photographic processes like the ambrotype and tintype made cameras more accessible to the public. They were still not household appliances, but they were no longer reserved solely for the elite. Historians still argue whether reports of working-class sleep rituals with cameras were satire published in humor magazines or authentic examples of people misinterpreting aristocratic trends. Either way, the belief trickled down, and the camera became a folk remedy for insomnia. Quirky tidbit. Some households couldn't afford a real lens at all, so they fashioned wooden boxes with glass bottles screwed into them, insisting that imitation was enough to fool the restless mind. Neighbors joked about these dream drains, though many swore they worked just as well as the expensive versions. You can imagine someone telling a friend, "You don't need Paris brass, just 3 pickle jars and a shoebox, and you'll sleep like a baby." The rituals in these homes were often charmingly inconsistent. Some families left the machine facing the bed, others pointed it toward the ceiling to draw away night spirits. One baker's wife believed the contraption should be covered with a damp cloth so that nightmares would cool themselves before escaping. Another insisted on sprinkling lavender water over the lens cap, claiming the scent traveled through the machine and flavored the dreams. You can't help but grin. Half kitchen science experiment, half bedtime theater. Of course, skepticism buzzed right alongside. One schoolteacher, famously weary of such nonsense, told her pupils that the machines were nothing but wooden spiders catching pockets of air. Yet even she admitted she slept better when a neighbor's camera was pointed at her rented wall. Placebo? Probably. But then again, placebo has its own kind of magic. The middle classes were also fond of blending this sleep photography with other nightly remedies. A man might place a jar of vinegar under the bed to trap bad humors, light a candle in a saucer of milk to soothe the air, and then, proudly, aim his family's prized camera at his pillow. The combination was ridiculous, yet comforting. When your world is ruled by uncertainty, any routine that promises rest is treasured. And there were comic disasters too. A grocer in one town fell asleep with his camera pointed squarely at his feet and woke up insisting that the machine had stolen his ability to walk straight. He stumbled around for days, refusing to blame the ale he'd consumed. Another man tried to double his odds of rest by placing a second-hand mirror inside the camera box, only to frighten himself half to death when he saw his reflection staring back at him in the moonlight. Still, these rituals brought families together. Children learned to tiptoe during camera nights. Mothers hummed lullabies while fussing over angles, and fathers boasted about how quickly they had drifted into slumber. If the aristocrats had turned their bedrooms into shrines of performance, the middle classes had transformed theirs into workshops of imagination, where faith in the device mattered more than the brass itself. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or confined to pockets of eccentric communities. Satirical illustrations from the period certainly mock mechanical dream catchers. But then again, satire usually needs some seed of truth to thrive. You're left imagining a patchwork world of families convincing themselves that cameras, real or makeshift, were guardians of the night. And so you wander from townhouse to townhouse, listening to the creak of floorboards, smelling the mix of lavender and lamp oil, and watching ordinary people place their hopes in boxes of glass and wood. They may not rival the grandeur of nobles, but their belief is just as sincere, and perhaps even more tender. The sleep machine myth, you realize, has found a new home, not in gilded mansions, but in the hum of everyday life. By now, you've sat through parlor rituals, aristocratic pageants, and the pickle jar contraptions of ambitious shopkeepers. But the strangest theater of all doesn't unfold in parlors or kitchens. It takes place in the pages of journals, pamphlets, and the dusty margins of intellectual debate. Scholars, doctors, engineers, and self-appointed philosophers of repose bicker across columns of cramped print, arguing whether cameras truly influence sleep. You picture stacks of brittle paper smelling of ink and mildew, each page stuffed with contradictions, rebuttals, and the occasional sarcastic jab. Mainstream historical fact: the 19th century was awash with competing journals, medical, scientific, even spiritualist, that debated everything from magnetism to mesmerism. Photography, being both wondrous and poorly understood, naturally fell into these pages. Historians still argue whether the sleep camera theory began in earnest medical circles, or whether it leaked from parody into quack remedies that journals then half-seriously considered. Either way, once the presses rolled, the idea took on a life of its own. One medical quarterly claimed the shutter's click emitted vibrations harmonious with the lull of brain currents, likening it to a natural lullaby. Another insisted the photographic plates absorbed visual overstimulation. leaving the mind free to wander into dreams. And then, tucked between such claims, you find a furious rebuttal. A physicist ranting that cameras were no more capable of curing insomnia than a teapot placed on a window ledge. You can almost hear him slamming his desk. Quirky tidbit. A little-known fringe pamphlet, Somnolent Optics, proposed that the silver salts in photographic plates ate excess wakefulness in the air. Its diagrams show stick figures with little lightning bolts zipping from their heads into shiny metal plates. The author promised that future generations would sleep 1,000 years at a stretch. Ironically, most readers probably nodded off after the first 3 pages, not from science but from sheer boredom. The debates weren't always polite. Journals mocked one another in footnotes, accusing rivals of sloppy experiments or of being secretly in league with photographic merchants. The tone veered between scholarly dignity and schoolyard squabble. One entry ends with the huffy remark, "This correspondent seems to nap often during his own lectures. Why blame the camera for his drowsiness?" Academic shade, 19th century style. And of course, there was the lingering influence of spiritualist movements. Some journals tried to tie the sleep machines to seances, insisting that cameras siphoned off dream energy the same way mediums claim to channel spirits. The slumber, one essay declared, is merely the soul agreeing to be photographed by the heavens. You can imagine your eyes rolling as you read that, though perhaps with a sleepy grin, because even nonsense has its poetry. Meanwhile, more practical thinkers conducted dubious experiments. A group of French physicians placed cameras around asylum patients, reporting that the number of nightmares declined. A British engineer argued this was coincidence, claiming asylum keepers had simply removed the patients' late-night cheese rations. Historians still argue whether these studies were genuine attempts at science or elaborate pranks that spiraled out of control. The debates dragged on for decades. Every time photography advanced, wet plates, dry plates, portable Kodaks, the journals flared up again, insisting the newest device might finally unlock the mystery of restful nights. Opponents rolled their eyes. Supporters doubled down. Neutral readers yawned and went to bed, perhaps secretly wishing the machines did work. You imagine yourself flipping through those yellowed pages, hearing the rustle of paper, smelling the ink, and sensing the egos behind every line. The journals may be forgotten, the arguments laughable, but the passion is still palpable. And strangely enough, their disagreements gave the myth longevity. A theory mocked, after all, doesn't die. It lingers, like a rumor whispered from one dusty archive to the next. And so, as you drift among these imagined scholars, you feel caught in a gentle tug-of-war. One side insisting the camera is a lullaby machine, the other dismissing it as pure delusion. Somewhere between them lies the truth, blurred like an overexposed daguerreotype, impossible to pin down. And so, as you drift among these imagined scholars, you feel caught in a gentle tug-of-war. One side insisting the camera is a lullaby machine, the other dismissing it as pure delusion. Somewhere between them lies the truth, blurred like an overexposed daguerreotype, impossible to pin down. The arguments in journals leave you restless, perched between curiosity and amusement. But eventually, the lofty quarrels collide with everyday experience. It's not abstract theories or stuffy academics that expose the truth. It's the clumsy, messy accidents of ordinary life. This is where sleep seekers begin to stumble onto reality. That cameras make pictures, not naps. One common mishap involves the long exposures required by early photography. Imagine a hopeful insomniac perched beneath a black cloth, told to sit utterly still for 10 minutes. The poor subject, lulled by boredom and the warmth of gas lamps, does begin to nod off. But instead of proof of a sleeping beam, what develops is a photograph of a blurred, sagging head, smeared like a ghost. When the plates are revealed, disappointment and embarrassment mingle. You can almost hear the muttering, "Maybe the machine's broken," or "Maybe I twitched." Mainstream historical fact. Many daguerreotypes and early photos show stiff, motionless sitters because exposures were so long. Some even used hidden head clamps to keep subjects steady. That rigid posture, falsely interpreted as therapeutic, was probably uncomfortable rather than soporific. Historians still argue whether the blurred sleep photos in private collections are evidence of deliberate nap experiments or just failed portraits later rebranded as proof. One quirky tidbit involves a farmer who brought his cow into town for a sleep session, claiming restless nights in the barn were ruining milk yields. The cow, uninterested in science, promptly knocked over the tripod and smashed the glass plate. Local gossip swirled. Some insisted the beast had rejected the sleep influence. Others joked that the cow just wanted her portrait taken from the flattering side. These accidental discoveries piled up. Families who tried photographing their children nightly, convinced the ritual fought off nightmares, soon noticed that the only result was stacks of identical, fidgety portraits. Children still cried in the dark. Parents sighed, their wallets lighter from chemical costs. In another household, a man left his camera aimed at his own bed, shutter open through the night, expecting to awaken refreshed. Instead, he woke to find the room smelling of chemicals, his wife sneezing, and the plate fogged beyond recognition. "Maybe the machine took the dream," he muttered. But the more likely explanation? Bad ventilation and a little overexposure. Even the traveling salesman couldn't dodge reality. One self-styled professor of somnolence promised that 5 minutes under his camera would grant the sweet oblivion of restful night. But when a particularly stubborn insomniac demanded proof, the professor exposed a plate and held it up proudly, only to reveal a shaky image of his customer's impatient scowl. The crowd laughed. Word spread. His business dwindled. Historians still argue whether these moments represent the death knell of the myth or just its transformation. Some claim the failure of these experiments finally opened society's eyes. Others argue people simply reframed the narrative, insisting the machines could have worked if only they were used correctly, or if newer models had been built. Humans, after all, cling to hope like cats to warm laundry. What's clear is that accidents became harder to ignore. The blurred portraits, the chemical fumes, the sneezing wives, the restless children, all chipped away at the belief that cameras were lullaby engines. Instead, the obvious truth loomed larger. The contraptions captured light, not sleep. And yet, there's a tenderness in these failures. You imagine those families, hopeful, huddled together in lamplight, whispering that perhaps tonight the machine would finally work. They weren't foolish. They were simply searching for rest in a noisy, exhausting century. Their mistakes, blurry though they were, shine like old negatives. Fragile, faded, but full of human yearning. The soft collapse of the myth doesn't arrive with a thunderclap. It's more like a quilt unraveling stitch by stitch. You notice that the bold posters advertising miracle sleep engines grow scarcer, the traveling salesman quieter, the chatter in tea shops less insistent. Instead, whispers circulate. These contraptions don't grant slumber at all. They only steal fleeting shadows of faces and rooms. The great unmasking begins in parlors where skeptical friends compare notes. One shows off a plate of her uncle, meant to demonstrate the man drifting into nap trance, but instead it looks like he's glaring at the camera, annoyed. Another presents a photo of her daughter, supposedly warding off nightmares, but the child is clearly mid-yawn, mouth wide, eyes unfocused, immortalized in the world's least flattering pose. They laugh nervously. The spell is broken. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, photography was openly recognized as a tool for portraiture and documentation, not as a medical device. The scientific community began cataloging its uses for study, art, and memory. Historians still argue whether popular belief in cameras as sleep aids lingered past this point, or if it collapsed swiftly under the weight of practical evidence. The aristocrats feel the sting most sharply. Remember those velvet chambers filled with expensive tripods and polished brass? They are dismantled one by one. Velvet curtains are drawn back to reveal that no one ever slept more soundly under the gaze of a lens. Guests whisper about wasted fortunes and absurd fads. A few stubborn nobles continue, insisting that the latest Parisian lenses might still hold secrets, but their voices tremble with doubt. Quirky tidbit. In one small town, the final straw comes when a prankster sneaks into a sleep salon and replaces all the expensive photographic plates with biscuits baked to the same shape. When the operator lifts a plate to show the crowd their supposed dream capture, he instead reveals a slightly burnt cookie. The laughter that follows is merciless, and within weeks the shop shutters. Public demonstrations, once crowded spectacles, dwindle into embarrassing affairs. Instead of awe, the audiences now murmur skepticism. Someone inevitably asks, "But where are the dreams? Why are we only seeing our own tired faces?" And the operators have no satisfying answer. Slowly, reluctantly, the word spreads. The great promise was nothing but misinterpretation. Yet there's no dramatic scandal, no angry mobs tearing down camera shops. It's more like dawn creeping into a room, the slow, gentle realization that you've been asleep to reality all along. Families who once posed children nightly stop doing so without comment. Physicians shift their focus to tonics and soporific teas. Traveling salesmen quietly change their posters from sleep engines to portrait machines, as if hoping no one will notice. The unmasking is both humiliating and liberating. You sense the sigh of relief in people who no longer have to pretend their contraption works. They can enjoy photography for what it truly offers, the preservation of fleeting moments, not dreams, but memories, not slumber, but something equally precious. Historians still argue whether society's quick pivot from sleep machine to art machine was driven by embarrassment or by wonder at the technology's real abilities. Either way, the spell is broken. The dreamers wake up. And as you trail through the quieted parlors and empty fairs, you notice the cameras still sitting there, brass gleaming, lenses catching the last glow of gas lamps. They may not have captured slumber, but they have captured everything else. Grins, scowls, yawns, moments of human awkwardness, forever preserved like pressed flowers in glass. The truth was hiding in plain sight all along. You walk through streets that feel quieter now, the grand commotion over sleep engines having fizzled into something more muted. But the cameras themselves remain, not tucked away in shame, but evolving, repurposed, reframed, given new purpose. What once promised drowsy magic now promises something else entirely. A chance to hold on to time. Families who used to pose their children each evening for nightmare prevention now gather on Sundays to take portraits in their best clothes. You see mothers adjusting collars, fathers smoothing hair, children instructed to sit very, very still. And while the ritual is no longer about coaxing sleep, it still carries a strange serenity. The hush of a family waiting for the shutter resembles the same quiet of a bedtime room. Perhaps, without realizing it, they've swapped one dream for another. Mainstream historical fact. By the latter half of the 19th century, photography became firmly rooted as a tool of memory, art, and science. From battlefield documentation to family keepsakes, cameras shed their mystical misinterpretations and found practical, enduring value. Quirky tidbit. One small town refuses to give up the sleep myth entirely. Instead, they treat photo albums as dream books, claiming that flipping through the stiff cardboard pages before bed can calm a restless mind. Children insist they sleep better after staring at grandma's ghostly sepia face. Maybe it's nonsense, but honestly, if it works, why argue? Historians still argue whether the persistence of these myths slowed photography's acceptance in scientific circles, or whether the absurd sleep theories actually helped draw public fascination that boosted the technology's fame. Either way, what you notice now is that cameras are no longer ridiculed. They're celebrated. You pass by former sleep salons, now proudly rebranded as studios, with shiny signs reading, "Portraits while you wait." Velvet curtains remain, but now they frame families instead of insomniacs. Former salesmen reinvent themselves as artists. Former doctors quietly stop making claims about insomnia cures, and instead commission photographs of their offices to prove their prestige. And you, drifting along in this slow, unraveling narrative, recognize the irony. A machine mistaken for a slumber tool has instead taught people to stay awake to memory. It has not lulled anyone into unconsciousness, but has jolted society into consciousness about the fleetingness of time. The failure of the sleep machine myth birthed something far richer: photography as art, record, and history. The clunky brass boxes no longer promise to cradle your dreams. They promise to hold your past in all its awkward, imperfect beauty. That's no small consolation prize. In fact, it may be more magical than the dream ever was. And now, as we ease away from the last echoes of this curious tale, let the pace soften. Let the details blur at the edges, like a photo fading gently with age. You can almost picture the brass lenses dimming, the velvet curtains settling into quiet folds, the chatter of curious crowds dissolving into nothing more than a faint hum in memory. You're no longer wandering through dusty parlors or watching doubtful aristocrats argue over dreams and daguerreotypes. You are simply floating now, as if your mind itself were a long exposure plate, absorbing the stillness around you. The rush of history slows to a calm trickle, and you can rest in the thought that humanity often mistakes one wonder for another. But in that confusion, something beautiful is still created. Feel how your breath moves evenly, the same rhythm as a slow shutter opening and closing, in and out. Each moment a captured frame, each exhale a quiet release. The clamor of those misguided sleep machines is gone now, leaving only peace. Imagine the gentle ticking of an old clock somewhere in the background, steady and soothing. You might picture yourself in a sepia-toned room, soft candlelight on the walls, the air carrying a faint scent of wood and paper. Safe, unhurried, warm. Let the story dissolve, leaving no sharp edges, nothing urgent to hold on to. Just a sense of calm, like the faint blur of a photograph where movement was too soft to capture. The cameras never gave people the dreams they wanted, but tonight they've given you one more thing: a path toward rest. And with that, you can let go, close your eyes, and drift.